So what we're going to be talking about in this session is Trails funding panel discussion. So match sources, collaborative partnerships, creative solutions, challenges, and success stories. And as you might know, my name is Jesse Sims. I work for RCO. I'm also part of the board member for the caucus. I want to start and introduce our panelists that we'll be discussing today. So we'll start with Larry Leveen.
Hi there. My name is Larry Levine. I am the Executive Director of ForeverGreen Trails, a Pierce County-wide trails advocacy nonprofit.
Thank you, Larry. And we can switch over to Mackenzie.
Thanks, Jesse, and hi, everyone. I'm Mackenzie Dolstad. I'm the Stewardship Program Manager for the nonprofit Mountains to Sound Greenway Trust, looking at supporting conservation enhancement of the landscape from Puget Sound across the Cascades to Central Washington, and working to support a lot of the trail recreation use that's happening within that area.
Awesome, Mackenzie, and we'll move it to Allie.
Hi, folks. My name is Allie Tripp. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Strategic Initiatives Manager at Washington Trails Association. WTA is working towards our vision of trails for everyone forever by mobilizing hikers and everyone who loves the outdoors to explore, steward, and champion trails and public lands.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Allie. And Yvonne.
Good morning, everyone. Yvonne Kraus, she, her. I am the Executive Director at the Evergreen Mountain Bike Alliance. We work statewide through 8 chapters on a lot of trails, both new and existing for maintenance. So really excited to be discussing that this morning with you all.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Yvonne. Thank you for being here. So a few, like, as Lisa said, during this panel discussion, we'll be utilizing the Q&A feature. So as our audience members, please feel free to put all your questions in there as we go through a list of questions for the panelists, and I will try to review those and get them to the panelists to answer as we go through the session. So to start off, beyond attaining grants, what types of things does your organization do to attain funding for trail maintenance and or development? And since you're on the screen, Yvonne, why don't we start with you?
All right, Jesse, I'll try my best, and I'll chime in if I think about something else that comes up as we go through the panel discussions, right? So, well, first and foremost, our trail funding sources are incredibly diverse, and I think the main message that I want to share in, as I introduce some of those funding sources for us as a not-for-profit is there are no competitors, and I think that's really the main idea. There are no competitors in this space, so it's all about collaboration and partnerships and figuring out where and how you can make the resource happen and then keep it maintained and sustainable in the long run. So as a not-for-profit, we do have, the option to collect resources, funding from a number of different resources and funding streams. So obviously we pursue grants, both public sector and then private sector. So we're doing corporate grant applications with a number of companies like REI and Hydro Flask or Keen or whatever organization could assist us and has an interest in the outdoors. We like I said, pursue public sector grants, so state, federal, and local grants, but we're also starting to pursue more RFPs. There's certainly in my industry, in the mountain bike industry, a movement taking, what I call mountain biking out of the mountains and putting it in our communities in smaller parks and smaller scale infrastructure, recreation infrastructure development. And that means that smaller towns and cities are issuing more and more RFPs for the development of recreation resources as well. Obviously, we still get a lot of donations from our members. We get donations from our what we call high-level donors through special programs. And then we do 3 specific campaigns every year to collect and raise funds for specific projects that we call shovel ready. So we really market and identify the opportunity for projects that are ready and they're happening if you can support. economic developments and special or economic development authority funding is becoming more and more common. Rural communities funding more and more common. So we've really seen the option for funding expand over the last 2 years, and I'll stop there so that others can chime in on how they're making use of those expanding opportunities.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. We're just going to move through each panelist with the same question. So we'll move on to Allie. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Well, I really appreciate what Yvonne said about the emphasis on partnership between particularly the organizations that are here on this panel. We all work together an enormous amount and collectively share, the same passion for trails. And that's one thing in the nonprofit sector that I love striking down is the idea that we're in competition with one another. So I really appreciate that. WTA, Yvonne touched on a lot of our funding sources outside of, great sources like the RCO grants that we receive. We have individual contracts with land managers statewide, often based on a commitment of volunteer hours that we are, committing to on an annual basis, although sometimes those contracts do last longer than 1 year. We were really excited to receive additional funding in 2021 from Region 6 of the Forest Service through the Great American Outdoors Act, which is one of those expanding new funding sources that was also previously mentioned. And then, yes, we have, 26,000 member households across Washington state that pay a wide variety of annual donations to WTA, from just $20 a year to in the much larger sums. And those individual donations offer us the flexibility to backfill certain projects that aren't being funded by particular land managers. One of the challenge areas we see is as we've moved into our work on the trail next door, so urban trails in particular, the funding sources are fewer and farther between. So those individual donations really have helped us focus particularly on those communities with the least equitable access to trails and green space. But yeah, I'll stop there and let the others say something as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Allie. And we'll move to Mackenzie.
Great. Thanks, Jesse, and thanks, Yvonne and Allie, for all that. There's a lot of great conversations, a lot of great collaboration between and among so many organizations in this, and I think that's a pretty strong message throughout that I suspect we're going to hit repeatedly on these other questions that we have. But I was thinking about this question from a slightly different angle too. In addition to the conversations that have been brought up so far, one of the things that the Greenway Trust has as an option as a place-based organization. There are some positives and drawbacks that come with that, but we have a smaller geographic focus than, say, my colleagues here. We're looking statewide and regional, and we have this different focus where we can really apply that framework on this landscape. And a lot of the projects that we end up working on are in development for 5 or 10 years before a shovel hits the ground for the first time. And one of the ways I was thinking about this is figuring out how, what's the bigger story with any individual project? What is there land acquisition or conservation history that's tied to it? Is there ecological importance for that landscape? Could this project in a regional trail, a wildland or soft surface trail, something that's connecting agencies or jurisdictions where there's a role to play to link multiple aspects together to kind of fill in those gaps? Are there ways to look at multi-benefit solutions? So could a trail be part of a land acquisition as part of that larger package that comes together? And then thinking about, how do these projects fit into plans that are being developed by agencies or cities or communities, and how can that be used to sort of set up for future programs that might exist when funding is expanded? Because I think one of the things too is we all know a lot of the existing public grant programs or public funding sources, and they're fantastic, and we'd love to see them, grow the pie, because costs continue to increase for some of the work that's being done, but some of the grant programs, we're not seeing those pools grow or the eligibility amount go up. And so what are ways that organizations like us and all of us can work to advocate for expansion or new funding programs that tie into these different partnerships? And this is great following up on the presentation that was just given by WSTC and thinking about active transportation or health or other pieces that kind of fit into this puzzle. and really kind of looking at how all of that can fit together and then using that to explore new programs and partnerships. And maybe I'll just pause there.
Okay, sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Mackenzie. That was really wonderful input there. We'll move on to Larry now.
Well, my colleagues did a great job of covering a whole lot of the bases, and that phrase, I'm just going to recall the phrase, growing the pie. That is absolutely crucial. Unlike some of the other the folks on this panel and in the conference, my organization doesn't build trails at all. Our role is to support the local jurisdictions, the governments, the park districts that do build trails. And so we're always busy trying to innovate and survey our members and figure out what do they need, because the jurisdictions themselves can vary greatly in terms of their internal resources and what they need. So we can't assume that they all need the same thing, but everyone does need dollars. And so during our recent conference, I was describing some changes that my organization was undergoing, and that we're reframing as a sort of a sled dog, if you will. We're a sled dog for the jurisdictions. And really sled dogs don't operate it alone. One dog pulling a sled, it's a team of sled dogs. And so working together in a coalition to grow the pie is absolutely crucial. So I want to just encourage folks to join not just the state coalition, but sometimes there are regional ones, whether it's Leafline or even national coalitions. You have to do that, and you have to be involved in advocacy events like WWRC and WRPA help put on to protect funding and grow the pie. And even though you're hoping to not talk about grants in this question, look at some USDA grants if you're trying to develop trails in rural areas. They have some interesting opportunities.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Larry. Did you have anything else you wanted to add? No. Are you good? Okay, well, we have one question that I wanted to address to the panel before we move on to our next question. It's from Jeff Chapman. He's basically saying there's a lot of trails, NGOs that seek grant funding for front country, suburban, urban trails, and shared use paths find that there are limited options that aren't exclusive to agency applicants. Should some grant programs like WWRP or NOVA be opened up for NGOs to apply? NOVA does allow some NGOs for some motorized trail projects. And I think, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I know Yvonne, you have been involved in that process quite some time. So if you feel comfortable, maybe you could chime in on that.
Well, I don't feel comfortable making decisions for RCO, but I'll comment on Jeff's sort of request. And yes, absolutely. In some cases, I think there are opportunities where if NGOs could apply, it would open up a few more applicants and build in an area where maybe the public sector doesn't have capacity right now. And again, that's that partnership opportunity. I will say, Jeff, that we're working in an environment that's always creative, and we're always looking for opportunities to find a way in the door, right? And to make a project happen or to keep a trail maintained. And so as an NGO, what I do is I assist with whatever public sector, whether it's a city or a county or other agency, and help to co-write the grant that they will submit. So very recently, for example, the city of Seattle went for a grant, and we helped write most of that because it's a project we'd like to see happen, right? So if you're running into capacity problems, there usually is a way in the door, and again goes back to that idea of partnerships and how can we leverage each other's resources to actually allow that agency to apply successfully.
Thank you, Yvonne. Larry, did you want to touch on this subject matter also?
Sure. And while I can't speak for RCO,
Correct.
I noticed and admired they had a request, I think, to the governor's office during the whole last budget process for an equity-oriented recreational facilities grant program. And the fact sheet that I had seen implied that that nonprofits might be eligible applicants to that. That did not come through in the governor's proposed budget, but in the state budget that was eventually passed by the legislature, there's a, I'm going to guess it's a pilot program, funding for a pilot program for something that sounds a whole lot like RCO's original proposal. We have yet to see what their rules are regarding that that program, because they're busy doing other really important equity-oriented work within their agency. But stay tuned, and hopefully what comes out of the rules that are published for this pilot equity grant program will allow NGOs to apply. We don't know yet, but fingers crossed, as one of those NGOs, fingers crossed.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Larry. So we're going to move to the next question, and this might have been somewhat discussed previously in the previous question, but I'm going to put it out there, and if any of the panelists feel like you already covered it, that's fine. We can move on to the next, but why don't we start with Larry with the next question is, how do you leverage your existing resources? So we were talking before about beyond attaining grants. So what, with the resources you already have in hand, how do you get the best bang for the buck, basically?
Well, I don't know. I think that, you know, part of that is a question for those who develop trails for, you know, getting most out of it. But one thing that has come up for an organization that often supports local jurisdictions in trail development, and that development taking the form of paved trails very often. I mean, I like to make it very clear, ForeverGreen Trails is surface agnostic. And although a lot of our attention goes towards connecting all of our communities, our incorporated communities, we support active recreation and mobility, whether it's, you know, your local regional trail, an intra-park trail that's not connected to a network, or, you know, a remote alpine or backcountry trail. If it's active, we like it and support it. With that said, I think that it would be great to get better information out there, and this could be a service that is provided by, you know, at an event like caucus or a conference, so that local jurisdiction staff understand what types of services comply with ADA requirements and thus potential strings attached to their funding, but that might stretch their trail mile dollars, if you will, so that maybe we don't need to pave everything that we're paving, and it can still serve everyone, because everyone should be served, and we need to make sure that our surfaces and trails and the approaches to them are accessible for everyone. So that's one idea, and certainly having coordination in your trail projects with, you know, it's rare you just have an isolated trail that goes, you know, essentially nowhere. You don't just go, you know, up and down a line. It connects to other jurisdictions, hopefully, with the, you know, some exceptions, but often trails will do that. And so having that coordination, can be surprising that's not just a given. You have to, it takes effort to make sure that things are coordinated. And when you go for grants, even if you're not getting additional dollars from, you know, that other jurisdiction, just the trail, the grant agency, that potential funder, when they understand that there is that kind of coordination, that I'm told helps grant applications. So it's not a project in isolation. They're really, by giving to one jurisdiction, they're really giving to multiple.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Larry. Allie, it looks like you have some information you'd like to share also.
Yeah, definitely. To transition well off of Larry's point about coordination, I think that coordination between organizations, like when I think about a real success area for WTA is over the last several years, our work in the Pasayten in coordination with the Pacific Northwest Trail Association, the Pacific Crest Trail Association, and the Backcountry Horsemen of Washington. And really those coalition and partnership efforts aren't a set it and forget it. There's something, that investment and coordination is something you have to plan for on an annual basis and should, be a responsibility of someone within the organization to be managing. And then, but the other, sort of big leverage point that we use at WTA is our unbelievable community of volunteers. In a normal, what is normal, but in a normal year, there are about 5,000 of them across Washington state. And I mean, I don't know what amount of work we would get done without them, but it would be very small. And the continued investments in that community, our focus over the last several years has not necessarily been to grow that number of volunteers, but to improve the volunteer experience and to expand the skills of our volunteer leadership community. We have paid crew leaders across the state, but we also have volunteer crew leaders who are doing a tremendous amount for the organization, and investing time in their training and skills has really proved fruitful. And then our assistant crew leaders, we have 160 of those. And when we think about who's the face of our organization, to many brand new folks who come out to try a trail work party for the first time, it's this assistant leader that they're interacting with. So really focusing our volunteer program on just empowering and enhancing the leadership of those folks has really helped improve the experience of our volunteers and bringing more and more people back to continue maximizing the effort that we're able to do statewide.
Great, thank you so much, Allie. Yvonne or Mackenzie, would you like to share? Or are you guys good?
Sure. No, I think Allie, I'll add one thing here, Jesse. I think Allie and Larry covered that really well. Allie, thank you for bringing up the volunteerism, and ultimately that is what we attribute all of our success to, and we're ultimately a volunteer-based organization as well. So without that and without levering that resource, we wouldn't be where we are. I think one thing that's really worked for us as a not-for-profit is there are two things that we leverage. One is the advocacy with the land managers, meetings with land managers, creating the relationships to make sure that we both understand the need and we follow up on opportunity. And then we leverage our board and the resources that we have built over time with purpose to assist the state agencies, public sector with match funding on grants, including RCO, right? And so we use our board every year to look at the number of projects and opportunities that are out there. We have what we call a trail fund, and we have what we call a restricted funds for those shovel-ready trails. And statewide across 8 chapters, we agree which trails we will basically focus on in terms of a campaign, and which trail system creates the success story to then, lead to other projects or lead to more volunteers getting engaged or lead to securing maintenance funds once those trails are in place. I think there's nothing better than celebrating a success story on the trail, whether it's new or whether it's a complete rebuild and reroute and with improved sustainability, right? And so when we have those small successes, when we invest our resources towards a certain community project, we develop goodwill, we create a story, we engage our volunteers, we build the future stewards of those trails. So we really focus that with our retreat every year is, here's what we've raised for the trail fund, here's how we're going to strategically invest that.
Thank you, Yvonne. Mackenzie, did you have anything or?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I'd love to, there's so much that I think each of us could say. I think we could each spend, 4 hours talking about what makes success. So I just want to touch on a few points that did come up, talking about coalitions and leveraging abilities. I think that there's some overlaps here. I want to acknowledge that we're a relatively small organization. We have 2 full-time kind of recreation focused staff, and then a number of our team helps dabble in it from various parts of their positions, including me. But we're
okay. It looks like Mackenzie's, we might have to go back to Mackenzie. Oh.
All right, am I back? I think my power just blipped. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I know you're back. We can hear your voice.
Great. Well, sorry about that, everyone. I'm not sure what happened there. But just leveraging that skills and resources, so agency staff, they may have limited resources, but really are willing to bring what they can bring to the table too, and just tapping into that, or thinking about our ecological restoration experience. How can we look at trails and facilities and think about weeds and other factors that are impacting the ecosystem, and just sort of putting that larger picture together.
Well, that's awesome. And since I got you on the line here, Mackenzie, it's kind of, we just keep on doing this through all the questions. It's amazing. So it's, we're talking about where have you been able to celebrate success, your organization in general. I mean, let's just put for the last couple of years, how do you, I mean, obviously this has been interesting times,
Absolutely. No, that's a great question. And I think, Yvonne, you just touched on this too, but celebrating success is about recognizing everyone that contributed to something for us. We're a small organization, and we succeed by and through our many different coalitions of partners. And that recognition of that partnership is huge, whether it's through, the trails, like the Leafline Trails Coalition, or whether it's through our Snoqualmie Valley working to connect different municipalities and jurisdictions, or whether it's through individual projects, say, looking at a site like the Camp Brown day use area in the Middle Fork Snoqualmie River Valley that had partnership with the Forest Service and multiple trail and construction contractors and volunteers, or work that's underway right now on Rattlesnake Ledge Trail, working with Seattle Public Utilities, Washington Trails Association and their volunteers. Earth Corps is going to be involved, contractors, the Greenway Trust kind of helping to pull it all together. Finding the ways to celebrate and tell these stories, whether it's through tours or at our annual event as an organization, where we really try to celebrate and highlight these partnerships and what everyone working together can highlight, and telling that story in an effective way so people recognize how many partners are playing a role, from the agencies and the land managers, and which jurisdiction is actually responsible for certain space, and how that all ties together into this large, complex package. I think that's one of the most important pieces we can do. And then continuing to use those successes to tell the story for the need for ongoing maintenance and operations, like growing the pie. Some of these pieces that are less maybe sales worthy, but equally important, is how do we care for what we have longer term, and how do, all of us working together, finding more access to resource to care for these places, so that we don't need to renovate a trail every 10 or 15 years when it falls into disrepair.
Well, thank you very much, Mackenzie. Allie, would you like to chime in on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. I loved everything you said, Mackenzie. Absolutely. The things that I have learned in the last 6 years at WTA about the complexity of public lands management. You don't know what you don't know, and it's a wild world. Some successes at WTA over the last 18 months or so that we're really proud to celebrate. The first actually ties into the additional funding source and a growing of the pie that we've been talking about. The Great American Outdoors Act funding allowed for us to hire our first ever professional backcountry trail crew this summer. I mentioned, while the volunteers are the backbone of our work at WTA, there are trails that are kind of in such bad shape that it's hard to get volunteers that far into the wilderness, or to ask them to spend 8 days, logging out hundreds of logs. So it was really exciting to hire this professional crew. They spent 71 days and over 4,000 hours for the most part in the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest. And they just got into some really tough spots and did some really incredible work. And we're very excited to have this new model as an additional tool in our tool belt moving forward. We're also really proud of the expansion of our series of shared identity trail work experiences. These are opportunities that focus on bringing out a particular identity of folks on a given work party, sometime a multi-day experience and sometimes just a single day. We had our first ever BIPOC work party this year. We've had a series of successful LGBTQ work parties and a long history of all girls and all women's work parties. And these spaces are designed to just break down an additional barrier to help people feel more comfortable trying something new. And the responses from participants are that it's doing just that. Some people have said, I don't know that I would have come out to try trail work if it hadn't been for this particular opportunity. So we're super excited to welcome more and more people into stewardship and to understanding the role that they can play in stewarding trails across the state.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Allie. Yvonne, would you like to share any insight?
Yeah, thanks. Building on what's been said and without repeating it, I think I have the lucky job of working with the mountain bike community that loves to celebrate all the time. And so we celebrate through a lot of community events. And I know the other organizations are doing that as well, but really keeping that community and grassroots feel going. And then from my perspective, and what I haven't heard yet is celebrate the successes with the elected officials and the state agencies who helped make it happen. That is hugely important. And sometimes, you know, agencies, parks departments, cities, we're busy. We have a lot going on. So allow us to help you promote the project and a success and the investment that you made. The picture behind me is Beacon Hill State Parks in Spokane, or just outside of Spokane, where I got to celebrate and ride with the local team that was building a downhill trail that State Parks made possible for us. And so visiting those sites, making sure we bring elected officials and of course agency staff and the project managers to those sites to celebrate the successes. We at Evergreen are really good at celebrating our trail team and promoting our trail team. I think we're way better in promoting our internal resources and celebrating the fact that we are incredibly scrappy as an operational team. So we almost have sort of the inverse of, Larry, I loved what you mentioned about being trail agnostic. Like we are all dirt. We are all dirt and grit. And so this year we had 27 trail builders working statewide, many of those doing backcountry trails. We had 98 employees on payroll. So we are celebrating the fact that most of our donors' funds go directly to the trail. And the fact that we have an office that barely has furniture doesn't matter to us because we're working to celebrate the trails. So we're really proud of that. I thought of one more thing. Let me see what was. Oh no, I mentioned it, I think. The tours with elected officials, use that recess time. That's how we need to celebrate our joint investments and the partnerships.
Okay, thank you very much, Yvonne. Larry, is there any last stuff that you'd like to cover that you find necessary or deem worthy?
I just love that outreach that Allie described with maybe traditionally underserved groups. We'd like to think that trails are accessible to all, but it's up to all of agencies, nonprofits, everyone to actually make that reality happen. And it's an ongoing thing. It's a process and not a place that you arrive at. So our annual Pierce County Trails Day, we had the most number of activities across the county from Mount Rainier to Gig Harbor area, and a record number of new partners and involvement with equity-seeking organizations. And because they are trusted entities, trusted by the populations that they serve, that they concentrate on, that's how we can kind of make good on our pledge of equity and the trails being for everyone, is by working in collaboration and with organizations like that, and helping reach the true diversity of our populations in Washington State, and particularly in Pierce County, where we are working. And we also celebrate this past year a great fundraising partnership with Pierce County to essentially prove a public-private partnership on 2 grants that they had applied for and that wound up leveraging $1 million. And maybe there's another question coming up where I can go into that a little bit more, but it sounds like you wanted to wind up the question, but definitely do celebrate, do get out at the locations, and do invite elected officials or their staff. That really helps them see, and you'll be surprised, they get stuck in a lot of meetings, and being outside, it can be surprisingly attractive for them, or not surprisingly attractive for them, but mom always says it never hurts to ask those elected officials and their staff.
Thank you very much, Larry. And that's a very, very good point. I hear that loud and clear. We had a question that states, how are nonprofits adjusting their grant application planning based on social justice emphasis reflected in expectations such as those in the Lean Act? So any panelists like to take that one?
Sure.
Okay, great, Larry.
Yeah, well, thankfully, I think that it's not that that we have adjusted our grant applications, because again, we almost never apply for grants, but when we do, there's a great program providing in-kind services through the National Park Service that folks can apply for, and utilizing that kind of data, and RCO has a great tool that anyone can use to see if an area qualifies for reduced local matches on grant programs, or perhaps your own areas, if you're working, say, in more front country stuff, and the area that you're working in is covered by a long-range parks, recreation, and open space plan, or a PROS plan. If your jurisdiction's doing a good job, like Pierce County did with theirs, they did a pretty good sort of needs analysis, if you will, looking at what areas of the county have trails, or have other alternatives, sidewalks, bike lanes, or are lacking them, and that section has just other demographic and health metrics, and that has helped us when on the rare occasion that we go out for a grant, we're able to utilize that information. So get familiar with the plans that are already in place, and also just research some of the tools, whether it's stuff from health departments, so that you can make those kinds of arguments. If you didn't have that data at your hands before, at least get familiar with the tools. You don't have to memorize the data, just know what tools are out there, so that when you are going for grants, you can kind of get that information.
Great, thank you very much. Mackenzie, you look like you might wanted to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to I appreciate the question, and Larry, thanks for addressing it both before it came up and then after. I think this is a really good one too. And it's a really interesting question. It was in my notes for what comes next on our panel. But a lot of the work that I think we're all talking about is partnerships and relationships. And I think that thinking about these grants and programs, it's not to me so much how can we kind of incorporate that into what we're wanting to do, but how can we take the skills and the knowledge that we have and make the connections with the communities that know what needs they have. So we're kind of a regional organization, and we've been approached by a number of partners to look at these connections between communities and parks. And so how can we sort of move at the speed of trust to build those relationships that then lead into project development along the way, and not just parachuting in and saying, let's fix this problem, but how can we build an authentic relationship with different communities that have been historically marginalized and have good knowledge of what they want to see and how they want to see their spaces improved, and how can we bring, say, different experience or access to resources, or our understanding as organizations, or access to resources to apply for RCO or state or other grants that have higher barriers to application. How can we leverage what we can do to support folks who know what they want to see on the ground, and build those relationships such that that work just becomes a meaningful part of who we are as organizations and what we're doing, and really just lean into that authenticity that will come to those grant applications over time. And it's great to see entities sort of starting to push for those questions to come up too, to encourage us to be making these connections.
Thank you very much, Mackenzie. Allie, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, just to tag on to those points, Mackenzie, I think something that I've been seeing or that I would like to see more of, frankly, in these larger grants is easier ability to be re-granting funding to smaller community-based organizations for work that we're doing on the ground. There are, as Mackenzie alluded to, there are a lot of barriers to these larger grants, just at the basic level, the reimbursement model, the idea that you have to have the funding in order to get the funding back. And, you know, we've been doing a lot of work prioritizing areas, particularly in our urban work, that have less access and less resources. And that's great. That's all well and good if WTA can prioritize certain projects that way. But we really want to be directing funds specifically into the community-based organizations that we work with. And we've done that in some creative ways. That actually touches on a later question around pivoting due to COVID. We've adjusted our mini grants program to not be reimbursement based and to be more focused on our partner organizations' general operating funds. But I'd love to see, you know, that our whole emphasis in this panel has been on partnership, but how we can be better partners when we receive these larger grants. And part of that is about the grantors getting more flexible about how we get to spend some of the money that we use for these big projects.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Allie. I'm going to move on to the next question. And Yvonne, was there something, or were you wanting to tie into something? Go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. Yep, I'll raise my hand next time, Jesse. I'll keep it brief. I think Allie just mentioned that goes right back to partnerships and Mackenzie integrating as opposed to looking for separate grants is how we're approaching it as well. However, that said, I will say that, you know, as we're working through our DEI committee process and setting goals, we have pursued specific grants. The No Child Left Inside grant, for example, is one where we're partnering with, just like Allie mentioned, you know, additional not-for-profits who work specifically in that space, who can help us be better and be more welcoming and understand where we are not reaching our audiences. Bringing those mountain bike trails from the mountains into communities, right? And really shifting the focus from an accessibility perspective is hugely important. Like, where are we building and where is the need? And putting our desires as a mountain biker in our old school mountain bike way aside and putting ourselves in the shoes of the future mountain biker who lives maybe in an urban or suburban area. Yeah, I think it's really shifting how we think. I will say that partnerships like Outdoors for All, lots of new creative ways, and then most of our opportunities in this space actually lie with corporate contributions and corporate initiatives who help make things possible for us. So leveraging really the private world here to make some things happen in a space where certain grant restrictions are sometimes challenging.
Thank you so much. All panelists, that was great information. I'm sure that really, to me, it helped a lot. We're getting close to the wire, but I want to get through specifically the questions from the audience too. So I want to touch on another one. It says collaboration requires gathering if we want representational participation. How do we put requests in our grant to go where people gather and garner first-time community participation? How do others fund their food, forum, and keynote speakers, perhaps so that we can be successful in holding successful gatherings? And Yvonne, I think you probably have some background in this.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And my first reaction, just thinking about it, is for us as memberships. So the membership resources really are about creating community and creating the space for myself to do the advocacy work and be in the communities for presentations, for events, at the table for planning opportunities, right? And our general membership funds is what make that happen. And we work in two ways to protect that very hard. Number one, we don't make our membership dollars, we don't increase them. They're the same way. It should be very easy to become a member of Evergreen, and it should not cost you much, but there should be a value so you feel like you're a contributing member to make those specific things happen. we can now be in the community and have the resources and the room for that, with, like I said, a pretty small staff. I'll keep it at that because Larry had his hand up, so I want to make sure he's got his time since we're running a little short on time.
Well,
Yes.
ironically, I was going to maybe prompt you with an answer to that question. Well, frankly, because you mentioned corporate sponsors, and so if the question was asked because they're finding it difficult to build requests in for funding to go where people are in grants, then don't ask in grants. Try more flexible funding, and maybe you can make those kinds of requests from the private sector, from corporate donors, and help. Just if the grants are only really aimed at building the facility, then go where there's more flexible dollars for those more flexible needs. But you should always speak to those, because the grant agencies need to know that the things, that kind of outreach, extra effort and outreach really is important. So I applaud the question.
Great, and thank you very much, Larry. And Allie, if you have something short to say.
I was going to say the same way I'd like to, we all want to see us growing the pie for, funding, maintenance, and construction. I think growing this pie and doing this joint advocacy work to help grantors understand just how important funding for these items like speakers and panelists, and particularly those from marginalized communities, is really critical. So I think we can all do a better job talking more about this, and continuing to push our funders to understand the importance of this as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Allie. I think there's going to be time for one more question, and we'll start with you, Allie. It's we've all seen dramatic increase in the use of trails over the past 2 years. What roles do you see your organization playing in managing this increase?
Wow, yes, this is such a great question. I'm glad that we're ending with this one. We've seen, if you think of WTA's hiking guide as representative of interest in hiking in Washington state, of which of course it represents a fraction, but our pie has grown a lot in the past 2 years, the boom. A couple of different examples of how WTA is thinking about this. Our leadership on the Recreate Responsibly Coalition, which grew out of the public land closures last year following the emergence of COVID. Sort of the evolution of that coalition, which is now national and has multiple statewide branches across the country. We see that group playing a role in thinking about the growth in demand for recreation and how organizations can coordinate messaging in order to maximize the impact. I was in Montana a few weeks ago and saw Recreate Responsibly messaging in my hotel and was very excited about it, to see it all over the place. WTA also is thinking a lot about dispersal and lessening the pressure on some of our most popular trails. We recently launched a new hike recommender feature on our website. So if you have a My Backpack account on WTA's website, you can now go in and see new suggested trails that are perhaps less busy than some of the other ones you may have saved, which is really exciting. This is still in beta testing right now, but we've seen some great results and gotten great feedback from folks. And we're also thinking a lot about what we're calling Trail Smarts. We launched a free bootcamp email series that thousands of people have signed up for over the summer that's going to adapt seasonally with best practices for new hikers. So if you have a new hiker in your life, feel free to send them that way. But we're thinking about this in a lot of different ways. And it's a complex issue and needs all of us to work on it for sure.
Okay, thank you very much, Allie. We'll just go down the line. Well, let's start. Mackenzie, why don't you give your final thoughts on this?
Great, thanks, Jesse, and thanks, Allie, for mentioning Recreate Responsibly. That's one that I was going to bring up too, the importance of thinking about coalitions and leveraging resources. But I think for just putting down my thoughts, I think we're going to continue a lot of our work in the Greenway landscape, looking at trails and facilities, trailheads, picnic areas, water access, thinking about accessible sites to meet people with maybe mobility limitations or families or other desires for places. How can we work within that? Really trying to emphasize a lot where we can existing places, renovation, maintenance, operations, and think about siting and how it fits in with larger context of ecosystem use and wildlife needs and recreation needs, kind of balancing that impact, like I was saying. Policy and advocacy, ecosystems, maintenance and operations, looking at those community trail connections, say between a community and the areas nearby, say in the Snoqualmie Valley, looking at connections between Snoqualmie, North Bend, and other areas, public lands, state lands nearby. How can that work across multi-benefits? Really looking at diversity, equity, inclusivity in the trails arena, listing all these coalitions, partnerships, projects, priorities. How can we continue to expand the table of who is sitting in there helping make those decisions? How can we make sure that we're writing in funding for community participation, for engagement in such a way that's really respectful of those folks and their time? The storytelling, tying into all of this, what's happening, where, how can people get involved? How can people support it? The Greenway is involved in a lot of coalitions. So we've mentioned some, and then the East Cascades Recreation Partnership, the Teanaway Community Forest Advisory Committee, and the Towns of Teanaway Project. Another one I just want to throw in really quickly is the Trailhead Ambassadors concept, that the Greenway, WTA, the Forest Service, state parks, Evergreen, the Mountaineers, others are working on to help figure out a way to have people at some of these high use areas to understand how to recreate, what some of the impacts are, what other places are, answer questions, something like that. Very exciting program that we wanted to launch, and then COVID just ran right into it. So that was a challenge. And then, the other thing is just thinking about accessibility, projects like King County's Trailhead Direct, and how can that be expanded or supported to meet some of these other priorities.
Well, thank you so much. That was really a lot of good work you all are doing out there. That's amazing. Larry, would you like to chime in, please?
Sure. Well, while there's a lot of, first of all, while there's a lot of trail use and trail use is up, that doesn't mean that access is up. So all of the other things that you've heard that folks are working on and the coalitions are really, really important. And if you are working in more community to community trails, making sure that if there's an equity analysis in those plans, that those, because you can have great equity language and even great equity analysis, but unless capital plans reflect the findings, then you're not really doing the job. And so making sure that recreational investments are equitably applied across an area, if that's the kind of work that you're doing, that's a really important step. And I think we helped improve Pierce County in that regard, and we're seeing some of the results of that, more attention being paid in traditionally underserved areas. So while trail use is up, we want access to be up. And certainly just more trails, it's part of that, it's the trails dilution solution. If you're having trails or trailheads just get hammered by a ton of use, I think that is, certainly taking care of those areas is part of that, but also making sure that there are more trails available to folks. So we're not concentrating all of the users there. And I love the Trailhead Director, Transit to Trails. That was actually reauthorized. Funding for that was reauthorized at the federal level. So I want to encourage folks to look into those and talk to your local transit agencies and make sure that they understand what that is, and offer to be an active partner in their grant applications to the feds for such programs, because that's another way of not just relieving trailheads of the pressure of a lot of folks trying to park there, but also for providing access for folks who can't afford or cannot drive, but they still want to enjoy the trails that we have. So, and certainly if we're seeing more use, I would like to think that we're seeing more potential members, more potential allies, more potential hands to help us with stewardship. So trying to always look at something not as, if as a problem, but as a potential resource, and it's up to us to kind of harness that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Larry. And Yvonne, would you like to finish it out with your final thoughts on this question?
Sure, lots of good points, but I'll mention two big things, I guess, or two key things for us. One is it is absolutely our responsibility to work with and identify solutions to the problem areas, and then help design those solutions and help them get funded so that the problems go away, right? And the way I think about that is complaints to us as trail-based organizations are a really good thing, because if we can help address those complaints and come up with solutions and bring those to land managers, to agencies, we're really doing our job. So as agencies, forward those complaints to us, because we do reach a large audience and can start thinking about addressing them, and are an intermediary there when it comes to that. So when I get a complaint that's sometimes really frustrating, I end up reminding myself that that complaint is a really good thing. And if that complaint came to us and not to the land manager, then that is a really just a good thing for me to start offering solutions. So shifting the perspective.
Well, thank you so much, Yvonne. And I also want to thank all the other panelists, Allie, Larry, Mackenzie. It's been wonderful, and it's been a lot of great information that I'm sure all the attendees will bring back home, and they probably might be contact you offline too about some of the questions and answers we went through. So I want to thank you all very much, and I think we're ready to transition to Lisa.